live with the one and only Mad Economist. I'm going to say at the beginning of the stream this time so that anybody who's coming to this video after the fact gets a sense of what we're doing here. So there will actually be a podcast available for this. I'll leave a link in the description once the video is complete on YouTube. I'll just download the video and then add the audio to a podcast. So check out the link below for that. But for the moment, we're going to go over a bunch of stuff with Mad Economist here. We're going to talk about measurement rigs in particular because he has been super useful and instrumental in helping us figure out what measurement rig to get. And we'll talk about all kinds of other stuff as well, like frequency response and headphones. And at the end, we'll do a Q&A. So save your questions for the end. But let's dive right in with just getting a sense of who Mad Economist is, because for people like, I see Metal571 in the chat, for us, we've kind of relied on you for information in general. And I think the first time I talked to you, we even I think we blew up Reddit and we pulled Marvy out of his SBAF corner, and
Gosh.
there was a lot of fun that was had with figuring out whether or not Floyd Toole is right about stuff. But
oh my God, I didn't even remember that actually. But yes, I recall that.
I think that was the first time. Yeah, but no, Mad Economist has been very helpful for all of that stuff. So why don't I ask, basically, who are you and what do you do? I know that you've done some modding with Cascadia Audio, modding the T50RPs with the Talos, but I wanted to ask you, what's sort of your background and how did you get into the headphone world and specifically the measurement world as well?
Okay, so ultimately it all starts with sort of analogously to Zach at ZMF, Dan at Dan Clark Audio. I made a T50RP mod, I listened to it, I was like, hey, that sounds better than the original version. I wonder why. And then I send it to a couple of people. They're like, hey, this sounds good. You could sell this. And man, that was a pretentious thing. Kind of wish they hadn't told me that sometimes. But for getting into the measurements, I came into audio from basically out of college, from an econ degree. That's what I was studying at the time. So I didn't actually come in from the technical side, so I was kind of coming in sight unseen on that front. And initially I tried to do things sort of by ear and by the seat of my pants, I guess. But I found that I really couldn't rely on my ears. And please clip that so that you can bring that up in any future.
Well, it makes sense though. It's the equivalent of if you're color grading for video, you can go colorblind a bit, and everything starts to look a little bit normal. I think the same is kind of true for audio. If you, especially this is something I've become aware of with EQ and stuff like that. But yeah, I'll let you continue.
So after a lot of chasing my tail, I got interested in measurements. And, we all saw Tiles measurements back in the day now, I guess. Rest in peace. And so I was sort of tangentially aware of them, and they were interesting. But then I was like, okay, well, these have to be useful to make things sound good, right? And I figured at the time, well, it seems pretty easy. Won't take more than a month to get my head around that. That's worth the time.
Right.
Several years later, many years later.
Right. So you got into it, modding the T50RP, and that is the Talos 2 now, right?
Yeah. Well, currently I have nothing on the market. The Talos 2, I dropped sales of that one once I really got underway on designing my own drivers. That's, knock on wood, hopefully in its final stages. So hopefully I'll be having in-house stuff and just fully in-house stuff coming pretty soon.
Awesome. Well, that's exciting. But basically, the trajectory has been very similar to many of the, let's say, celebrated, hobbyist turned manufacturers for you.
Yep.
Is that correct?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, awesome. I think to some degree because you pattern on, your precedents, but also just because once you try to make a headphone, you realize that it's actually shockingly hard to make a headphone physically.
Right. See, that's the thing, is I always think to myself, man, it would be really cool to get into trying to make headphones or even just starting to mod headphones, and everybody who's gotten into it says it's way harder than you think, right? Even people who are doing the modding thing, there seems to be also like an additional difficulty in terms of like getting something like that to market. You see headphones like the I'm blanking on the name right now, the Borealis, for example.
Yes,
where it's guys who've done similar,
more.
guys who've done similar things, and it's taken them years to get to this stage, right, where they now finally have a headphone and that they can sell. So I'm sure there's a lot more that goes into it that I don't think about when I think it would be nice to do this at some point.
Well,
But
I think a lot of it depends on what you're trying to do as well. If you just want to make something to listen to, I think that that's surprisingly easy. And I think more people should really just sort of, throw their nets in the sea with just sort of random, try it out, read a few papers, get whatever the cheap measurement rig that is the least terrible at the moment is. Sort of try to figure out how stuff works. But getting it to production it really makes you realize that the mechanical engineering of headphones, at least for me, was the really hard part. If I only had to do the acoustics, I think I would already have multiple in-house planar magnetics on the market. But it was everything else that really, and you have to do it with every headphone.
Right. So is the one, I don't want to give anything away here if you don't want to mention it, but
Oh no, that's fine.
Is the one you're working on going to be planar magnetic?
Yes, it's
Okay.
in-house planar magnetic driver. I basically everything I'm doing myself. Actually, I'm etching the diaphragms myself, putting the resists on myself.
Cool.
It's, yeah, I'm hoping it will be. I'm hoping it will be interesting to people.
Do you think I've talked with Oratory about this as well, but do you think it's easier or more difficult to use a planar driver compared to like a moving coil driver?
I mean,
or no difference?
that's a deep question.
Yeah.
I think that for the normal way that you make a planar magnetic, or that people tend to, it is easier. A normal planar magnetic headphone, if you think about your Odyssey, if you think about your Hi-Fi Man, is sealed front volume, open rear volume, no connection between them. It's basically a Grado, if you think about it, or maybe not a Grado, but like I don't know, like one of the very early closed front, open back headphones. I'm blanking on an example. I guess the Stax would be an example of very early Stax, like the SR1.
Sorry, when you say closed front, you mean like sealed around the ear?
Yes, but you can have a headphone that's sealed around the ear that doesn't have its front volume, the area in front of the driver closed.
Right. Yeah.
An example of this would be Foster's headphones. The Denon and the Fostex TH series all have a very complicated acoustic linkage between their front and back, and between the front and the outside. But if you look at an Odyssey, it's just a driver, basically a sealed area between the driver and your ear, and the driver pushes your eardrum.
Right.
It's pretty simple.
Right. The standard principle for like open back headphones.
Well, for planars, because that's
for planars,
the thing.
yes.
If you look at like an HD 600, it's actually much more acoustically complicated in terms of how its front is designed. There's an integrated link between the front and the back, which has damping. There's a leak that exists between the front and the outside. So, and you have to do that to get, I don't know, a good sound from a normal moving coil driver. For a planar magnetic, they tend to be a bit closer to what we would prefer. I don't want to say naturally, but just if you throw them in there tightly coupled to the ear. And that, I think, makes them, in some respects, makes them simpler to get to a place where people are happy with them. I don't think that necessarily it has to be easier to implement them, and I think that you could do quite interesting and complex things with them. But I think that the average planar magnetic that is good is probably simpler than the average moving coil, which is good.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, that's a super exciting headphone that I actually wasn't even aware you were developing. But
yeah, I try to keep tight-lipped on stuff until it happens because I've had a lot of stuff that exists on my test bench that has
Right.
never existed, e.g. my
Okay.
electrostatic thing.
Okay, so we'll knock on wood for this then.
Yep, very big knock on wood there, but
Right.
here's hoping.
Cool.
Fingers crossed.
Cool. And so, is the like headphone development then, manufacturing eventually? Is this a full-time thing for you, or is this just something that you're doing on the side, or yeah?
This is at the moment pretty much a full-time thing for me. It's
Right.
particularly as doing just the acoustic stuff. I think I was able to sort of juggle it with other things. At the moment, I'm pretty much whenever I'm not doing acoustic stuff, I'm yelling angrily at machines and hitting them with wrenches.
It sounds like the dream. Um,
Uh,
when we spoke before, you mentioned that like a lot of what you were doing was looking at like edge cases and outliers and things like that, when you're testing stuff.
oh, yeah, metrologically.
Yeah, I wanted to ask what's the reason for that?
Well, I mean, like everyone agrees on the normal case, right?
Hmm.
Like no, everyone basically wants frequency response, and everyone has a general agreement on what frequency response should be. Because
Hmm.
whether you're a diffuse field target person, Lorho target, free field, Harman, they're all basically an ear resonance. Then either it's flat at the low frequencies or there's a little bump up, but they're not that different. So within the context of normal measurements, everyone since Tile started doing measurements on a KU100 hasn't really been that far apart in what they want. And you know, with the proper grains of salt, you can compare and analyze all of that stuff pretty well. And that's the most important shit, to be clear. Like
Hmm.
that is what is important. That's why, for example, Oratory only publishes just frequency response measurements in the linear band. And I think that for a reviewer or for someone who just wants to know what to buy, that's probably the most important. Well, I mean, that's definitely the most important. That's probably the only thing you need.
Right.
But as a designer, you don't just want to characterize the typical case.
Right.
So when I'm trying to, it's sort of like penetration testing in security and software and stuff. You know, if you're just testing how something interacts with a normal user, you don't necessarily care that if you knock on it 3 times at this angle, then the door falls off. But as a designer, you should care about that.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So actually, I mean, the reason why I was asking this, I think, is it was pointed at something a little bit different. I was
Gotcha.
wondering, you know, what I was thinking like edge cases in terms of like back when Tile was doing, square wave and stuff like that. Thinking, maybe this is a way to push the boundaries on the ability to discern information um, from measurements. Um,
Well, it depends on what information that you're looking
right.
for.
Right. Right.
A square wave, in a sense, so if you think about what a square wave is, it's really a sine wave and then an infinite sum of odd harmonics, right? So the
Hmm.
main thing that you see with a square wave is bandwidth. But
Right.
headphones are quite bandwidth limited. Tile, I think, liked them because they visualized frequency response and phase relationships together. But you can simply pull the same information out of frequency response in that case because of, headphones being minimum phase and the fact that we do impulse responses for them.
Right.
Um, I think square waves. I don't know. I never saw their appeal, to be frank. I think I mean, with one exception, Ty used square waves to check seal while he was mounting headphones on heads. I think that was quite clever.
Right. I remember seeing that video where he used the Odyssey one, and he showed where the seal was broken.
Yep, that was quite clever. But that's really
Yeah.
just showing where he's using it to measure frequency response.
Right. Right.
For edge cases, a lot of stuff can still be measured with a fairly conventional frequency response measurement, like linearity or broken coupling behavior. You can measure both of those just with the same exact frequency response measurement and still get all of the edge case information you want.
Right.
I'm trying to think, are there cases where I would want a different measurement? I mean, there are cases where I do different measurements, but I'm not sure if there are cases where you need different measurements much.
Hmm.
I mean, I guess it depends on what you define as different.
Right.
I don't think there's a case in headphones where you don't need something based on a Fourier transform.
Right.
I, but I think that something like an FFT, like what you're looking at right here, which is the Fourier transform of my voice, as opposed to frequency response, and is interesting sometimes when you want to look at, for example, the harmonic spectrum of a sine wave, or the distortion products of some other more complex stimulus. Because if you think about it, what this is doing is taking the input and breaking it down into level by frequency band. So if you had a 1 kilohertz tone and there was nothing else, it would just be a vertical bar right at 1K.
Right.
But in practice, we have
Yeah.
noise, obviously. I mean, like, my voice isn't quite gravelly enough to be producing 20 hertz, so that's noise in my environment and noise in my converters and stuff. Um, and we have distortion products. We have harmonics. We have, in some cases, we even have subharmonics. We have, for multi-tone stuff, we have intermodulation products. And
Yep.
the audibility of these things is variable. So some people just produce aggregate figures like THD, and the THD, and some people publish ARTA's harmonics. Like they have a few harmonics that it extracts from impulse response. But I think that might be less, for me, that's less useful than looking directly at the spectrum of a sine wave, because
Right.
sometimes things go a little bit eccentric in ways that are not captured just by counting the first 3 or 4 harmonics.
Right. I mean, but also, I mean, essentially, what you're talking about is like in, uh, the reasons why when you hit a piano note, you don't just hear one. You don't just hear one frequency. You see, like, if you were to see that visually represented the way that your voice is right now,
Oh
it
yeah,
would be, yeah.
yeah.
You'd
It'd
see
be
it.
a string of
Exactly.
harmonics.
Yeah.
Although pianos are particularly strange, because my understanding is that pianos, being string resonators, don't actually have harmonics that are perfectly aligned with the bass frequency. It's one like so
Mm.
it's not actually even multiples. I don't actually know this much because I'm not a musician, but I looked into tuning pianos once, and apparently it's why it's like a skill.
Oh, it's a real pain. As someone, I used to actually play, and it would. I know this was a big issue because everybody was also stressing about like where the microphone placement should be for recording pianos accurately because of how weird some of the resonances were, and how variable they were.
Oh yeah.
But
I mean, recording instruments accurately is a hard
yeah.
question.
But yeah, just getting back to the headphone stuff here.
Yes.
Okay, so that's why you're looking at edge cases, and I guess I mean it makes a certain amount of sense that I'm just thinking of other cases of headphones, like for example, there's a headphone that I have here, the Andover PM50, where I think it's possible to get it to sound okay if you only listen to it with like by pressing it in a certain way and like holding it in place in a certain way. And it makes me think anybody who
Oh
was maybe
goodness.
measuring that one only looked at that as the frequency response, or if they even measured it at all, not realizing that in all these other cases of how it might be seated on the head, for example, it would be totally different, and it'll sound, well, I don't know, I think it sounds particularly bad, but I'll do a review of it soon.
Hmm.
um, but okay, I wanted to get into the measurements themselves,
All right.
and I want to ask what you think about. Well, first, let's talk about the measurement rigs. So, for anybody who's unaware, we being headphones.com, recently purchased a measurement rig based on Mad Economist's recommendation. We ended up going with the Gross 43AG.
Of
And
Sean Olive fame.
yeah, with the latest pinna and everything, and so we're super excited to get that up and running. But that's also a measurement rig that is, I mean, if you look at like the spectra of like what else is out there, like the B&K 5128 and stuff like that, like this is a rabbit hole that goes very deep, and also very there's a very wide range in price for how much some of this stuff costs.
Well, you'd say a
And
wide range, but it doesn't really go that far down,
No,
unfortunately.
that's right. It doesn't go that far down, but I mean, it can go very high.
Yep.
And so, but what I was just sort of thinking about is, with the 43AG, I mean, that's on the like less expensive side of things, comparatively to, you know, like the 5128. And I wanted to get your take on, at least as far as reviewers are concerned, or publications. Do you think there's more value in perfect accuracy for information above, like, you know, 8-10k hertz, or because that's more difficult, more challenging to do, or is there more value in consistency across um, uh, publications? So for example, if everybody has a 43AG, um, or maybe a 45, whatever it is, right? Like if everybody has the same measurement rig, is that more valuable than that one rig that's the 5128 that one person has? What's your take on that?
Well, I think it depends on if it's from the perspective of a reviewer or from the review consumers to some degree. Like, as a reviewer, if I really wanted to distinct myself and,
Mm,
like, let's say I'm a reviewer who really wants to make a splash and say, you can't trust anyone but me. Having something like the 5128 would mean that I could technically be correct in saying, oh, no one else is as good as my system. You can, you should always take me as the definitive word.
right.
But from an end user perspective, the actual difference is not very high, and the fact that there will be comparability issues between that and the existing standards, it may actually make it less useful to anyone who's reading it. So
Right.
it sort of
Yeah.
depends. Like, I, given the very high variability of high frequency, and by high frequency I mean past 8 to 10k measurements, and for that matter, HRTF in that band, it's, I mean, I don't want to say it's a crapshoot. Obviously, it is measurable. There are patterns, but it's not something that I would say is in any respect worth $40,000, and particularly not worth $40,000 and breaking from compatibility with
Hmm.
what we have from Harman to date. Although I'm told they're going to be doing something with 5128, so maybe not forever. Um, and I think probably most importantly for most people, being able to compare to the surprisingly large now body of people who are doing public measurements with
Hmm.
43 AGs.
Right. So that's kind of my thinking as well. I mean, we've talked before about how this measurement stuff is, it's constantly a moving target, where you're constantly
Mm.
trying to, you know, keep up with whatever the, if the 5128 is pushing the boundaries, right? And, you know, maybe there'll be another thing in the future, but I'm just thinking of like that situation where, when the mini DSP ears, which is behind me, when the mini DSP ears came out, and
It's behind all of
every,
us in a
yeah,
sense.
exactly, right, like every reviewer ended up getting one because it was so cheap, and it was, I mean, I suppose better than a flat plate, but um,
It is.
there's always that question mark when you see publications that have a measurement posted using the mini DSP ears rig, because it's not industry standard, it's not as accurate as, you know, it ideally would be. And but then the question is like, well, where's the value in that? And I think there was a lot of value in the comparability aspects, because everybody happened to have one. So you didn't necessarily have the headphones somebody else had, but you might have had the same, or you didn't have, yeah, say you wanted to compare different headphones using the same rig, and even though it's total variability even on the same rig, at least there was some sort of constant there when other people were using the same system, right? Now, I'm led to understand that it's not as simple as just saying, you know, everybody using the same rig means that we can actually compare measurements across different headphones like that. But the idea, at least in principle, I think was kind of cool. And now I'm thinking to myself, maybe if everybody starts getting these, you know, whatever the next step up from that is, right? Maybe there's a body of knowledge there, or a body of information there, that is comparable and is consistent, that is more useful to the reader or the end, you know, the prospective buyer, than the super, you know, the boundary pushing one, right? Um,
Well, absolutely. And in
yeah.
theory, if we think about it, the thing about the ears and about earless flat plates and other mm, flawed measurement systems is that they can have the difference between two headphones on an earless flat plate, whatever, might be different than the difference between those two headphones on your ears. So that is to say, the rig doesn't reflect how you'll hear them different
Mm-hmm.
in all cases, and that's the real problem of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
Right.
for something that's anthropomorphic, that is actually mirroring how your head works properly, in theory, those differences should be fairly constant.
Mm-hmm.
And that means, in theory, compensated data from a good rig, whatever that is, should be generally comparable. That's sort of the interesting thing. Like, the nice thing about everyone having the exact same rig is that even uncompensated data should be pretty, common between them. But in theory, if you have, the diffuse field HRTF of this hats and that hats, their outputs should look pretty similar once they're compensated for that. So
Right.
so to some degree you can actually have commonality all the way back to, I don't know, like probably the first Kemar, if you could find data from it. That'd be like, I don't know who would publish that, but maybe Mead Killian did.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So so even though it's moving in the sense that we get better, like there are tweaks, in theory there should be a lot of agreement between all of these systems across time, for the same
Mm-hmm.
reason that there's agreement across what people hear, in reality. Like you and I probably don't hear an HD 600 that different.
Right. And actually, I mean, on that subject, what do you
Mad
think
Economist
about?
voice has too much THD. Not good /10. Yes, I should definitely not have left the THD display on. I don't know why artist shows that with a non-signed stimulus.
Uh, but yeah, on that subject, what do you think about uh, headphone sound demos? We using potentially more accurate rigs and more accurate systems. Is the compounding effect still going to make kind of invalidate them, or is there ever going to be a point where we can start actually getting some information from sound demos, even just comparably?
It's a hard question.
Mm-hmm.
I think in premise a sound demo can work quite well,
Mm-hmm.
but the circumstances where it will work well, I don't think can happen with the current tools available to end users. So you said the compounding thing, that's pretty much the exact extent of it. If you recorded a headphone on a rig, equalize out whatever the rig is adding to it. Pardon me, I do have some THD in my voice. Then play it back on a headphone that was perfectly flat, that was perfectly mirroring whatever the proper HRTF of whoever is wearing it was on. That would sound like the additions of the original headphone, because the chain there would essentially have canceled out the recording ear and the playback headphone.
Right.
But where are you gonna get the headphone that is perfectly flat? And if you already have the headphone that perfectly matches, whatever the target is, why are you listening to other headphones?
So that's actually a really good point that I hadn't thought about before. But I mean, that's always the concern that I've had with this stuff, is that you don't know what that's going to end up being on the headphones on your specific ears, right? So even if you think the headphone measures flat, or it measures relatively, flat, based on a compensation that you like, you're still not getting that measurement for how it is on your ears.
Yeah, well, and how it is on your ears is relative to your HRTF, which
Yes,
is
yes, exactly. Yeah,
also
yeah.
flat as a concept is one that probably merits more poking, but
Right.
that's an issue aside for just the second, because I wanted to have an add-on here because I actually have an idea about this.
Okay.
And someday it's one of the many projects on my test bench that probably won't turn into a product, but I think is potentially. One of the things that could work for a headphone demo is if people listening had in-ear microphones. Because if you
Hmm.
had an in-ear microphone and you could actually use that to equalize the playback headphone, you could
Right.
actually pretty much null out some portion of the transfer function between, you and the recording. Like, let's say that I have a blocked canal mic, I record a headphone, you have a blocked canal mic, you equalize the headphone you're wearing dead flat, not compensated flat, just dead flat at that microphone at your ear entrance. In theory, this whatever music or whatever I play gets modified by my outer ear, the headphone I was wearing, and your ear canal, and that's all.
Hmm.
And that would be probably about as close as you're going to get.
Hmm. The issue is that that relies on uh,
People
being
having the mics,
yeah.
which don't exist right
No.
now. I've put together a few of them, but they were really annoying to build, and none of the binaural mics that exist right now
Yeah.
are proper for this, unfortunately. Well, except for like something like Smith. Smith's realizer mics probably would work. So
Right.
if you have a Smith realizer, please phone in now.
Yeah, but see, that was the thing I always thought with sound demos, is that it was a really cool idea, but at present I almost felt like it was a bit almost like irresponsible, because the people who would be listening to them, even if they had the reference headphone, they they wouldn't necessarily know that. They wouldn't necessarily understand that compounding effect is doing what it's doing. Um, and so yeah, I mean, it's exactly as you say. Like, you, that's the challenge, is how do you get how do you make that happen in a mass, audience kind of world, right? And I just don't see it as being doable at the moment.
There was a concept that some DSP software, it's not the one from the Baltics. Oh gosh, how am I forgetting their name? They're like the biggest.
Yeah,
It's like the one that's the competitor to
the Sonarworks.
yeah, it's one of Sonarworks' competitors
Oh,
had
okay.
this software, so I'm really bungling this, but they had this interesting concept where they measured a whole bunch of headphones, and rather than doing a sound demo, they would equalize. They would basically have an EQ profile that changed one headphone to have a similar frequency response to the other headphone as they'd measured it. And their measurements weren't that great, and the EQs were kind of so it wasn't perfect. But I think that that was probably about as close as you'd get
Right.
to a sound demo with what we have now.
Right.
And it's
uh,
actually, I kind of wondered why folks like Jaakko Passanen, the fellow with the Auto EQ database, haven't done more like that. Although, of course, you know, it's only as good as the measurements you're drawing it from. Your units may differ, your on-head results may differ, etc.
right. um Sorry, just somebody says in the chat, Olive has those in-ear binaural mics. Yeah, what we're talking about is the person who would be listening would have to have something like that as well. I'm
Regarding
just
Olive, his mics are a little bit flawed, although I am actually trying to get a pair of my mics to him to see if that can help
cool.
with things a bit.
Yeah. But see, like, it's such an appealing idea. I think it would be really cool to be able to do that. Like, I'd want that to be a something that would be like, it would more than just comparatively predict what something would sound like, because there are certain things that I think you can find there. Like, Metal, I think, was talking about before about the listening to his recording of the HD58X, for example, and you can actually hear the grain that's there. And so it to me, it's like it would be really cool if you could make that like demonstrable beyond just the comparable thing that it is right now. But I guess we can move on from that, because I did have questions about uh, yeah, I wanted to get your take on where where measurements are going to go, headphone measurements are going to go in the future. And I've talked to Oratory about this, and I think you were actually on that podcast at the end.
Yeah, yeah,
But
busted in there. Sorry about that.
no, by all means. But do you think we'll be able to at some point look at a graph of, let's say, unsmoothed or all the information available, frequency response data, and then be able to point to how it's going to sound in ways that we aren't doing right now? So, for example, can we hold up a graph and say, here's where soundstage is, here's where detail is, here's where, dynamics is, and all that kind of stuff? Or is that just because it seems to be that there's still a disconnect to some degree between the captured information and our understanding of what that stuff means? And do you think that's going to go forward in any meaningful way?
Well, okay, now I think that there's sort of two categories of things to separate out there, and I'm going to put my cards on the table. I come from Some people call it the objective or objectivist side of the hobby. So I'm even prior to getting into the really
Right.
academic and professional stuff, but it's only been more intense from there. Um, so I'm more inclined towards that side of things. But for subjective things that we don't measure right now, there's sort of two groups of them. There's things that we generally that definitely exist insofar as we have an identified consistent phenomenon across people. We just don't necessarily have an ideal way to measure it. And a good example of that would be spatiality and localization. Like that is something that is being studied right now because you can pin it down to study it.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, there I can actually point to some things that might be indicative there, and I have some of my own theories. On the other hand, something like grain, where it's a word that people use, but it's not entirely clear that everyone uses it the same way, that they're pointing to the same herd thing. So we would need to first see that people are hearing the same thing before we could even potentially find measurements to find what it is. Because really, at the end of the day, what we look for is correlation. Well, correlation and theoretical justification for it. Like that's, induction.
Mm-hmm.
So for a lot of audiophile things that people perceive, same thing with dynamics, I think. First, you would have to be able to see if people can consistently agree this thing has dynamics, this thing doesn't, this thing has grain, this thing doesn't. Not universally, obviously, but just enough that there is a consistent pattern. And once you've done that, then you can go looking for what it is. And I think you probably can find it. And I don't think it's a limitation of our current measurement capability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it may be a limitation of the fact that we haven't actually documented what the commonalities are.
Right. So you effectively need to get all the headphone reviewers in a room.
But I mean, it doesn't have to be headphone reviewers. If these are audible phenomena, then
Right.
If you can find a headphone that a bunch of reviewers say, or maybe a group of headphones that reviewers say have these traits, throw them into a sample with headphones that don't.
Mm-hmm.
See what people see if a group of people who are not primed to hear it, and then look at what behaviors are common between the headphones. And it might
Right.
not be stuff that you see just in a single frequency response plot. Classic example of this in speakers is power compression.
Mm.
You won't see compression in one frequency response plot, but it exists. How do you see
Right.
it? Take two frequency response plots, two different levels. See how it changes by frequency.
Right. So you'd have to presumably just have all the data, potential data, available to you.
Yeah, and depending on what people hear and the circumstances under which they hear it, you can figure out where to go looking. When people hear speakers as lacking dynamics or being compressed, because they literally are, it's more revealed in dynamic music and it's more revealed at high listening levels. And that gives us an indication of where we should go looking, and we figured out tests to generally show that. And for headphones we can as well. And for anything we hear we can as well. But first we need to know what it is and where to go looking.
Right. So the first step to solving a lot of this stuff, or at least investigating a lot of this stuff, is getting agreement on, well, the terms that we're using and that we're actually talking about the same phenomenon.
Exactly.
Which I do think, I mean, this is something that I've come across even just with, a lot of the videos that I've done and, the articles and just talking to people. It's like people talk about this stuff in ways that are totally different, even though they might be describing the same thing. So, and then, on top of it, the fact that unit variation is a thing makes it even more challenging to get that kind of agreement unless you're actually physically listening to the same headphone, and just in the same room.
It's a very difficult thing to get a consistent agreement on how something sounds, because we have, I think, a much looser connection to our ears than we do to our eyes. They're obviously fundamental to us, but we often fall back on descriptions that are a lot more like descriptions of, food or wine tasters when we're describing sound aspects.
Yeah.
I think because we don't have the ability to really articulate you can't say something is square sounding in the same way that you
Right.
can see that something is square edged.
Right. Um, it's funny. It reminds me a little bit of some of the stuff that I remember studying a long time ago about um, how vision is actually non-Euclidean. We're much more visually oriented like beings than auditory or anything else. Like dogs have sense of smell, for example, right? So
Hmm.
for us, it's vision. And I remember studying about how vision is weirdly non-Euclidean, but our brains correct for that. And the way that you can test this is just look at the corner of any room that you know is a right angle, and just think about if you were to just try and draw that, you would actually have to draw it at a different angle from a right angle, at a non-Euclidean angle, because of the distance that you are away from it, right? So you're only getting the apparent object, and I wonder if one of the things with sound that we're getting is we're often, well, potentially our brains are correcting for different things with sound as well, that we're not able to pay attention to the way that, like, that's a fairly easy test that you can do with vision, but I imagine there's all kinds of stuff that happens with sound that we're not actually able to decouple our mental process from as easily, and then this might
Well,
also lead to some of the confusion there as well.
well, decouple. I mean, that's you don't want to decouple it. If you were just hearing things exactly as it sounded without any psychoacoustic
Right,
effect,
right.
everything would sound incredibly shrill because of your ear
Yeah,
gain. There'd be no
yeah,
bass.
exactly. Yeah, but I'm even just thinking of like stuff like soundstage and depth and all these audiophile terms that we're talking about. Like it might be one of the reasons why people have such different ways of describing things, because they're really just describing an experience, not necessarily anything to do with the way that something actually sounds. Like it's just their experience.
For
um,
soundstage in particular, we have a convenience that there's a reference in physicality. Like
mm,
people are talking about things as being placed in space.
yeah.
Um, some people have done a number of tests of that. Some of them have just been subjective. For example, what's called in-head localization is when people hear sounds coming from within or very close to the head as opposed to being out in the room. And there have been tests of things that influence that in headphones and speakers, actually. You can get that effect in speakers, which is weird. Um, but some of them have even done things like testing what affects how accurately people will place a sound source on different planes.
Hmm.
And there are things people think with spatiality in headphones. Perhaps not.
Okay.
Well, so to be clear, there is only. I mean, there are a million DFs, and there is only one DF. DF is just a condition for a room,
Right.
or for a head to be.
Yeah, sorry, I
When
mean
we
the
talk about
targets.
different D, well, yeah. In my case, I use the actual DFHRTF that came with my B&K 1428. It coheres pretty well with the ones that Hammershøi and Muller measured for the 4128, which are a little bit different from the population average, but quite close. Um,
Oh, see, now I'm
but
losing
yes,
your
that base.
voice for some reason. Sorry,
Oh
it's
shit.
man, I thought I had all this stuff figured out. Yeah, I'm getting
I'm
a little
so
bit of a
sorry.
robot-y um, sound here, but let's just keep going. Oh, hello. We may have
Hello, can
lost.
you hear me? Hello.
I can hear you, but it's a little bit on the robotic side. But
Oh no. No one likes Robo Economist.
all right, we'll be right back, guys. We're just going to restart this call.
Yep. Maybe migrate server.
Uh, Discord is actually fine. It's showing me full bars, so I don't know what's going on.
Same.
Yeah.
Oh jeez. All right.
Oh,
Well, let's try restart.
yeah.
Chat's telling me to turn off the auto tune.
All right.
Is that any better?
I can hear you fine. Let's just plow through it here. Continue.
Okay.
um, Sorry, what were you saying there about? You're talking about diffuse field. Um,
Um, Right.
And yeah.
So DFHRTFs are really just a measurement from somewhere on a head, either literally in a condition where sound's coming from no particular direction, or simulating that effect via, this or that method. And at the end of the day, this can produce some variations, but it's mostly the same thing. When we're looking at differences between, there's differences between the DFHRTFs Hammershoy Mullen measured over a couple of different studies, but they're not really as big, I think, as people make them out to be. Part of it is that, there's small methodological differences, microphones are placed a little bit differently, your sample population differs just a little bit, but these things are actually fairly common between these things. But I think, ideally you want to use the DFHRTF of the head and the ear that you are actually using. That's what I do. For, like a Brazier, I guess that would be a Keymars DFHRTF, but there's really not that much variation between these things. Mostly the difference is how heavily smooth the result was, to be frank, which record do this.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyways, continue what you were talking about. Minor technical difficulties.